From online echo chambers to real-world violence, radicalization is reshaping our world. But how does it happen? How do misinformation and propaganda turn everyday people into extremists? And more importantly, how can we stop it? But first, hit that subscribe button and like this video if you enjoy this content. Hello, my name is Wellington, and I'm a historian who specializes in deception, misinformation, and propaganda tactics. And today, I want to talk to you about how propaganda and misinformation lead people down the radicalization pipeline. So what is radicalization? Well, the definition is radicalization is the process by which individuals adopt extreme political or religious or ideological beliefs that can lead to violence or rejection in mainstream society. Some historical examples would be the rise of extremist groups across different ideologies. So think Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and even here in America, you could say the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the KKK, neo-Nazis, same groups in Canada, some same groups in Europe, and so on. All extremist groups, different ideologies. Eco-terrorists, some would say Antifa. Those are just some examples. And one of the reasons why we see this would be through online radicalization. The internet has accelerated the process of making recruitment and ideological reinforcement easier than ever. Radicalization just doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process, often beginning with small ideological shifts that over time become more extreme. Which brings me to the role of propaganda. Now, the definition of propaganda is it's a biased or misleading information designed to shape public perception and behavior. And how propaganda works is that it provokes emotional manipulation and performs repetition and selective storytelling. An example of this would be extremist recruitment videos, or misinformation on social media, and historical state propaganda. Propaganda isn't just about spreading lies. It's about controlling the narrative. It appeals to emotion over logic, making people feel like they are a part of something bigger. So let's dive into misinformation and disinformation and the effects of it. Misinformation versus disinformation is false information being shared unknowingly. So while disinformation is deliberately spread to deceive, misinformation is the unknowing or unwitting sharing of that information. So for instance, take when you see people before Facebook got rid of their fact checking and their stuff would say, hey, this content has been pulled down because it shows to be misleading information. The fact checkers there were providing you a courtesy so that way you don't fall under the unwitting behavior of sharing misinformation. Now that those fact checkers aren't going to be there anymore, we are going to see the rise of misinformation being spread on that platform. Just like on Twitter, because I refuse to call it X, on Twitter, you see how once Elon took over and got rid of the fact checkers and all that stuff, you saw what? You saw the rise in rightward leaning rhetoric that tend to be of a misleading effect taking place. They also were sharing, we all know. If you're following this, I feel like I don't need to explain it, but Twitter went down a dark path and it hasn't come back since. And Facebook, along with the other meta platforms, I fear will also go down that path. So you will start seeing some right-winged extremist ideology not being checked and not being censored. I mean, rightfully so. It is censoring. They were censoring it. But that is because the information they were sharing was misinformation. And now what I fear is going to happen is you will see the disinformation start playing in. Now that other governments know that fact checking on here is not going to happen, I would not be surprised and or shocked if, other nation states that try to meddle in what we do or what we perceive here in America start intentionally pushing out disinformation. And again, what is disinformation? Disinformation is deliberate spread of falsehoods, whereas misinformation is you just not knowing that what you are spreading is false. Misinformation is forgivable. Disinformation is deliberate, and it's meant to shape people's worldview. So, how does misinformation spread? Well, social media algorithms will push you into that echo chamber and provide you with that confirmation bias. If you've watched some of my earlier videos, I talk about that, especially on the media bias one. I talk about how the algorithm shapes our perception. The algorithm will force us down echo chambers because it wants to give us confirmation bias. It wants to make us feel good about what we think and what we know rather than challenge our own perceptions, our own bias. So that is what social media will do in the algorithm. And the role of influencers and bad actors show how charismatic figures will amplify false narratives. Now, I mentioned that before, right? With Twitter and the Meta platforms and my fear of them. How people who are on there, people who have a voice, will spread things either unwittingly or knowingly. And they just don't care, right? They want more of this. So, one of the biggest drivers of radicalization today is misinformation, falsehoods, right? Spreading faster and faster than the truth, fueling fear, fueling anger and division. And if you're a Star Wars fan, you know where that leads you. So that leads us to the radicalization pipeline. Now, I'm going to give you a quick example here. Quick explanation of the radicalization pipeline is that it's a gradual process where individuals move from mainstream beliefs to extreme ideologies. And these stages are curiosity and exposure, right? Engaging with content that subtly introduces radical ideas. Echo chamber effects. I talked about that, right? Social media algorithms that push more extreme content. Community and identity. Individuals find like-minded groups that reinforce those beliefs, right? So the echo chamber forced you down that tunnel, and now you're finding that confirmation bias. And then we get to commitment and action. Some individuals take real-world actions from protests to violence. And in the community that I work in, we call that, it's a three-staged effect. You have the radicalization phase, then you have the mobilization phase, and then from there you have the action phase. So there will be people out there who get radicalized and they will sit there in the mobilization phase forever. They will sit there and they will protest and push for their beliefs to be heard. And then you have some who take that radicalization, they move on to the mobilization phase, and then they become so ingrained in their thoughts that they move to violence. When I'm giving briefs to people, like to tell people that there's a final phase before the action phase, right? The violence, that you can stop somebody who is on that radicalization pipeline. And that's the mobilization phase. Before they take that violent act, the last chance that you can help de-radicalize them or stop the attack from happening is the mobilization phase. So, the radicalization pipeline isn't a straight path. It's a web of influence, misinformation, and manipulation. So now let's talk about how we can de-radicalize people and how we can break the cycle. First thing we have to do is we have to provide people with education in media literacy. It's kind of what I'm doing right now. So teaching people how to identify misinformation and resist manipulation. And again, if you go back and watch my media bias video, I talk about how Finland does a really good job at teaching not just their youth, but everybody from their youth to their elders, how they are teaching media literacy. And I feel like that's something that we could stand to learn from here in the US. So that way we can resist manipulation. So that's the first thing. The second thing is intervention and support. Programs that help people leave extremist movements. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can go and type in, ex-gang member talks about whatever, or ex-neo-Nazi talks about whatever, or, they're all out there. And I would highly encourage that if you see someone who's falling down that extremist pipeline, you provide them with that education, and then you intervene and provide them with that support. Maybe show them those videos. Maybe show them some, if they're a reader, maybe provide them with some books. But then that leads me to the next thing, community and dialogue. You have to engage in conversations that challenge radical beliefs in a constructive way, right? You can't just say, hey, man, that stuff you're viewing, that's some extremist type stuff, and then leave it at that. No, you have to provide them then with counterpoints. You have to provide them with stuff that's going to challenge those beliefs in a constructive way. They don't want to feel like you're belittling them. They need a community. So even if you provide them with the education, even if you provide them with that dialogue, or not the dialogue, but the intervention, if you do not provide them with that community, they're going to fall right back in line with what they were viewing and what they were ingesting, because that feels comfortable to them. And again, going back up, that echo chamber, it provides them with that confirmation bias. So what you have to do is engage in conversation that challenges their beliefs in a constructive way. And then the last thing is government and tech, right? The regulations, how platforms can limit extremist content. Now, I would think that governments out there should, and I fully believe that governments out there should regulate what the tech companies are doing, because they're only concerned about making money. Governments should be concerned about their people and protecting their people. Now, it's 2025. Here in America, you can go to libraries or buy books that talk about events that took place in 1933 to 1945, and even before then, because we all like to just point out 1933, the rise of Adolf and all of that. But fascism was already in place in a lot of other countries prior to. The whole Roman salute thing was never a thing. That took off because of a fascist movement in Italy during the 18th century, 1700s. So fascism was alive and well already, and that mindset was already there. So, it's not just 1933, but we can go back and we can read about those things. So now that we talked about that, I feel like every government should actually strive not to censor free speech, but to just check tech companies that would like to push out information, or not even them. It's not necessarily them. It's just when they remove that third, fact-checking organization that works for them or whatever. When you get rid of your fact checkers, that's where the problem lies. And I feel like government restriction and oversight would actually do the world a lot of good if we just allowed for fact checking to happen. You got to be able to take constructive criticism. The last video I made about little side tangent here about the eraser of indigenous culture, I made a mistake. I misspoke. I said that Kenya was never conquered. What I meant to say was it was Ethiopia. And somebody was in the comments and they're like, I thought Kenya was. And then I had to go, I checked, and I was like, oh crap, you're right. I misspoke. I meant to say Ethiopia. And yeah, it's still hotly debated if New Zealand was. I don't view it as them being conquered. They came to a treaty with the British government and then became a colony. But the Maui tribes, again, contested even until today, but they were never actually conquered in the sense of colonization. But yeah, constructive criticism. Somebody got in the comments and they said, hey, I think you might be wrong on this. And I went and checked and I was like, oh crap, you're right. Right? So you have to be able to give people constructive criticism, and that includes the tech companies. So let's get back on topic. De-radicalization. It isn't just about changing minds. It's about rebuilding lives. Okay? Again, you can provide the people with all of those things that I mentioned, but if you don't give them that community, the counter community, they will fall back in line with their extremist ideology. Right? Again, it's not about changing minds. It isn't just about changing minds. Again, you provided them with that education. You provided them with the dialogue and all of this other stuff. But once you provide them with that counter community to counter those effects from the extremist community they were a part of, you are now rebuilding lives, which leads us to the conclusion and my call to action, right? Propaganda and misinformation are big factors in how the radicalization pipeline starts. Influencers and charismatic people amplify false narratives, which drive people deeper into the echo chamber and shifts their worldview. So by recognizing these dangers and the changes in people's behavior, we can interject and provide individuals with the correct information and education, right? And in providing them with that community. So I encourage you to think critically about the information that you, your friends, and your family consume. And if you want a good resource, right, to check your media bias, I would say Ground News. Now, I'm not sponsored by them, but I use this application because it will check me on my own bias, right? It tells me who is watching or not watching, reporting from the left, from the right, and from the center, and it will give you their headlines. And then if you actually go beyond the free subscription and you use the paid service, from what I know and gather and understand, it will actually even tell you, it will give you your roll-up as to your own bias. So it will tell you if you are leaning to the right or to the left with what you are clicking on. So with that, I want to leave you with this. Misinformation and propaganda fuel radicalization, but awareness, education, and community can stop it. The fight against extremism starts with all of us. So, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Thank you, and have a good day.